from Toronto, Canada. Today is Monday, March the 29th, 2021. It's one of the ongoing series of podcasts, but this one is going to include a call to action. All people affected by the American extraterritorial tax regime, whether you're an accidental American, an expat, or an immigrant, there are big things going on in Washington at the moment. I have with me this morning Dr. Karen Alpert in Australia, Dr. Laura Snyder in Paris, and I will, I think, turn it over to them to direct today's conversation. Welcome, Karen. Welcome, Laura. How are you today?
Oh, fine, John. Thanks so much for having us on your podcast. So I understand there was a hearing from the Senate Finance Committee on U.S. international taxation and how that impacts American workers' jobs and investment. Can you tell us just very briefly what they covered in that hearing?
Well, Karen, I really got to tell you that the title of the hearing had almost nothing to do with what transpired. I noticed also that the hearing was supposed to be about, how international tax affects individuals. And as far as I could see, the hearing had nothing to do with that at all. The hearing began with basically a statement about how bad the 2017 Trump so-called tax cuts were, et cetera. It went on from there. And really what the discussion was about was the direction that rules for corporate international tax in America should take, with a clear emphasis in this hearing on the CFCs, and very, very specifically two things. One was the importance to increase the GILTI tax. Increase. I've heard the Biden administration talk about doubling it. And the second, and this was really interesting, and Karen, of course, would know a great deal about this, about how the first 10% return on tangible assets is exempt from the GILTI tax. And some of the witnesses were very much complaining about that and found it objectionable. In other words, they want, as far as I can see, to bring all income earned by CFCs into making it taxable immediately. It seems to me completely overriding the original intent of the legislation, which was to move, with respect to the CFCs, the United States to a territorial tax system. Now, leaving aside the specifics, as an observer of this over the last few years, observing specifically the issues surrounding the transition tax and GILTI, I think you will remember the Treasury actually bent over backwards to provide relief for individuals. Noting again, that the hearing did not talk about individuals, but talked only about corporations. In order to get that relief, that Treasury gave was actually predicated on, first of all, individuals in the context of a 962 election getting the same 50% deduction that corporations get. That was the first thing. And the second was basically creating a high tax kickout for income so that it would no longer be GILTI. And this was a generous, and I think, creative reading of the Subpart F regime in general. Bottom line is this: nobody understands the technicalities. The bottom line is very, very simple. The only way to double the GILTI tax is to get rid of the 50% deduction from income included in GILTI, which will absolutely apply to Americans abroad and destroy that for them. And the second thing is that there's absolutely no question that general increase in the in the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28% will destroy the availability of the high tax kickout for individuals. Bottom line, this is incredibly dangerous for individuals and will dramatically worsen their tax situation. What we need to talk about is the important role that individuals can and should play become part of this process and hopefully to get this stuff derailed. Interestingly, the committee began with the idea that somehow, they call them the Trump tax cuts, which is ridiculous because, this was actually the result of bipartisan stuff over a period of many years. What the Tax Cuts and Job Act did was essentially ended the deferral regime. All right. And what the committee is saying is, hey, we're not complaining about corporate giveaways. Actually, they're complaining that it didn't go far enough. They don't want, and they basically want to suck every cent earned by every CFC into the U.S. tax system immediately.
Wait a minute, John. Wait, a CFC, isn't that a foreign corporation?
Absolutely.
You're telling me that what Congress wants to do is to make sure that if you control a foreign corporation, it's no longer really a corporation. It's essentially a pass-through entity.
That is exactly right. Anybody who goes to law school learns about separate legal entities and the separation between a corporation and an individual. And the problem is that, at least the United States understands that it can't impose direct taxes on foreign corporations. So what they do is they impose them on the individuals instead. It's very, very important to realize that this is not a discussion about taxation of U.S. domestic corporations at all. It's a discussion of how to indirectly tax foreign corporations that they don't have any primary jurisdiction to tax by basically forcing the individuals to include that income in their tax returns, even when they've never received it.
So now, John, in these hearings, was there anybody in the hearings who had any experience of this as either a corporate shareholder of a controlled foreign corporation or an individual trying to run a business outside of the U.S.?
As far as I could tell, there was nobody in the room, whether a questioner or a witness, who had any experience whatsoever with any of these issues. It was truly an example of the blind leading the blind.
John, was there any mention at all of the effect that these rules have on Americans who are individuals who are living overseas and who have very, simple basic businesses, a doctor's office, a restaurant, a cafe, a yoga studio? Was there any discussion of that at all?
Laura, there was not even discussion of this as it could affect any individual on the planet, whether it's an individual residing in the United States or an individual residing abroad. It is very, very clear to me that these witnesses, either, I'm not even sure, frankly, they understand these rules apply to individuals, because any discussion of individuals was notable only in its absence.
So now they're talking about stopping American companies, American multinationals, from offshoring jobs, etc. Does that even make sense when you're talking about the dentist or the cafe owner in Paris who happens to be a U.S. citizen? Are they offshoring U.S. jobs?
Wow. Okay. First of all, you're asking two or three things at once. Let me break this down a little bit. What was particularly irritating and frustrating during the hearing was some of the witnesses constantly referring to U.S. corporations that have that make any of their money through selling in foreign markets as somehow offshoring, these being offshore profits. It's as though many of these people believe that the only reason that any American corporation, any American citizen would have anything whatsoever to do with any activity outside the United States for one reason only, and that's to avoid taxation somehow. As far as I could tell, it was actually only Senator Portman, of the questioners, who even acknowledged the possibility that a multinational, leaving aside an individual, that a multinational might actually be carrying on business outside the United States to make money from that market. So it was extraordinary in that sense. The assumption was that the only reason that an American has anything to do with anything outside the United States is to avoid US taxation. But let's say we get beyond that point. Again, it's obvious that these rules, not only do they apply to individuals, but they've been very, very damaging to the lives of individuals. I mean, the idea that your yoga studio in Australia, your dentist in Canada is somehow running their business to avoid US taxation is so ridiculous. It is so absurd. It is so depraved. Frankly, these people should not be involved in these hearings. It is very important. It is very important. It is vitally important that the individuals impacted by this make their voices heard immediately.
And so how can they make their voices be heard?
Well, Karen, as you know, whenever there's a Senate Finance hearing, what they do is they have a window period where people can make submissions. Now, our organization, SEAT, Stop Extraterritorial American Taxation, has written a submission, I think a comprehensive and honest submission. And we'll be getting it in very, very quickly. There are rigid guidelines on this. And at the end of this, perhaps I'll invite you, Karen, to make it clear what those are. But anybody can make submissions on this hearing. And we absolutely need every individual on the planet to do this. Now, help you, because one of the reasons this goes on is because I was watching this on YouTube, and there were only about, at any point, there were no more than 30 people in the world, 30 people in the world watching this unfold in real time. This is how they get away with this stuff, okay? So we prepared templates as well to help people use an off-the-shelf submission if they want that applies to their situation, but it's also flexible enough to allow them to add their own comments, which we encourage them to do. And you got to get these things in. They can get in by email. You need to get them in as soon as they possibly can, because what we need to happen here is for Senate Finance to get an avalanche of letters about this issue with a view to recognizing this affects individuals. All this talk about US corporate taxation affects individuals. And we expect to be heard on this, and we want to be part of the discussion. I think that's the general message here.
John, I've got two questions for you. The first one is, you said templates. You prepared more than one template. What's the purpose for each of the templates?
Well, first of all, the reason that there's a template is because, I'm spending some time assisting SEAT writing the submission, as we all had did. It's hard to write this stuff, right? You can't just sit down and write stuff easily that's relevant to this hearing. So the first purpose of the template is to make sure the content of what is sent in bears a direct relation to what went on in the hearing. That's the first thing. The second thing is this, that we all know that, sure, you can say, well, all individuals are affected by this in one way or another. There are different groups of individuals who are affected by what we have agreed should properly be called the extraterritorial tax regime, meaning the US tax rules that apply worldwide taxation to people who are tax residents of other countries. Some of these are accidental Americans. We have a template, for example, if you're an accidental American. These are just things that, we think should be brought up to illustrate your circumstances. We have a template for American expats. By expat, I would mean, somebody who, been transferred outside the United States. Notice I'm not saying offshore, transferred to another country to legitimately work for a few years. We've got a template for American immigrants, okay, meaning people who left the United States permanently. They're still US citizens, but they live permanently outside the United States. That would probably, I'm guessing, include us on this phone call, you know, et cetera. So we're also going to have a template for the owner of the small business corporation, the yoga studio, you know, or whatever. Now, the reason this is important is that this is a point we make in our submission, is that, you know, it may be that, you know, in America, people don't generally use small business corporations, but in Canada, Australia, you know, all kinds of big places, people do use small business corporations. It's part of intelligent retirement planning, et cetera. So for the United States Internal Revenue Code to define, you know, these small business entities or corporations outside the United States as CFCs is to take basically a wrecking ball to their retirement pensions, which is exactly what happened with the transition tax. So, you know, we've got one for the small business owner as well. And, you know, frankly, if you email us, I mean, we'll create a template for any group out there, you know, who we think we've missed, because we want to make it easy for you, like within 10 minutes. Okay. We want to make it so easy for you to be able to send in a submission that's directly relevant to what went on that day on March 25th, 2021. That's why this is important. That's, you know, we're trying to help you do it.
So, John, just to reiterate, the hearing was focused on businesses, but we're encouraging all Americans who live overseas, regardless of whether they have a business or not, to respond, to use one of these templates or not, but to make a submission. Is that correct?
Absolutely, because here's the point, right? Right now, today, we're talking about, you know, targeting small business corporate. You know, what we're talking about are corporate tax changes in the U.S. that, even changing the corporate tax rate, as I explained earlier, has a profound impact on an individual trying to run a small business corporation outside the United States. But this was completely invisible in the discussion. The point is that is a specific instance of how large-scale changes in the U.S. tax code can have huge impacts, or even small changes in the U.S. tax code can have huge impacts on the lives of those Americans abroad or are subject to the extraterritorial tax regime. Here's the bottom line, okay? You know, they may not have a business corporation. For example, in Australia, maybe they're running their business through a trust and they're not characterizing it as a corporation or something like that. This is one more example of the same principle. The United States has got to stop making these rules to apply to tax residents of other countries. And this is why it's important for, you know, people to get those letters in, unite on this. And again, you know, we've tried to make it as easy for you as possible.
Yeah, I'd also reiterate that the title of the hearing was How U.S. International Tax Policy Impacts American Workers, Jobs, and Investment. It clearly impacts the workers, jobs, and investment of Americans overseas, the way the U.S. Practices this extraterritorial tax. And that's part of U.S. international tax policy. So even if it wasn't covered by the people that were testifying in the hearing itself, I think that the positions of all Americans overseas are relevant to the stated topic of the hearing.
Well,
You know,
it should have been
there's
covered.
absolutely no doubt about that. An attack on one group of Americans abroad is an attack on all Americans abroad. And, you know, for this
So
reason,
to get your submission in, there will, by the time this podcast is published, there will be a post on the SEAT website, that's seatnow.org, that has all of the templates that John's described, a copy of the SEAT submission so you can see what we've written about it, and instructions on how to submit. You can submit by email. The email address is in the post on the blog. And it needs to be as a Word document, single space, not to exceed 10 pages, and your name and address has to be on the front page. Now, some of you might balk at putting your name and address on this, but if, you know, as John has said several times, activism is not a spectator sport. If we want to get Congress to listen to us, we need to all participate.
Absolutely. And let me tell you what I'm looking for here in terms of numbers. Okay. I mean, I hate to stick my neck out. We should be getting submissions in the multiples of thousands. All right. This is such an important issue. I mean, if you had seen, I know most people didn't, because there were only a maximum of, I didn't even think I ever saw as high as 30, but let's say 30 people around the world watching this thing, many of them who would have been tax journalists and that sort of thing. Trust me, if you had seen what I saw, you'd be outraged by this, and you would see the danger. Anybody who's lived through the transition tax GILTI stuff would see exactly what's going on here, and how this thing is going to unfold. So people have got to get involved ASAP. You got to stay involved ASAP. ASAP, and for the long run, they got to stay involved. And the starting point, for God's sake, we've done 95% of the work for you. All you have to do is print it out, put your name, address, scan it, and send in the email. It's all you got to do. So please do that. Karen, what are the deadlines, though?
So they have 2 weeks from the date of the hearing. So you need to make sure your email is received by the Senate Finance Committee by the 7th of April. But do it. Don't put it off. Just do it.
Yeah, we made it so you don't have to think about it, okay? You don't have to write it. You don't have to think about it. All we're asking is you say, well, am I a business owner? Am I an accidental? Am I an expat or INM? That's all you have to decide. You print out the right form, add a few extra comments if you want, signed, sealed, boom, delivered.
Word document in the email. So you just have to edit the Word document and send it.
And if you're wondering what else you can do in addition to making your own submission, a lot of people listening to this will be active on social media. You can share the link to the SEAT website that contains the templates, and you can encourage other Americans to make a submission if you're wondering what else you can do.
Absolutely. I mean, my impression is that, like, I'm not a Facebook person, but my impression is that a lot of people in Facebook groups are members of multiple Facebook groups. Or people on Twitter have a large number of followers, et cetera. So please help us help you, okay? I mean, no matter what we do, no matter how many submissions we write, no matter how many hours we spend on this type of stuff, if we can't get your support, we're not going to be able to achieve anything. And look, I will say, we have worked very hard on this submission, very hard for you, okay? So please, come on, do your part.
Okay, well, thank you, John, for explaining why this is so important. And I hope everybody will put in a submission.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, thank John, thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Karen. Thanks, Laura. And I look forward to seeing all of this in the blog post.